briefly torture. So if those are things that you have any experience with, you may find this material challenging. I'll just start by reminding anyone who doesn't know or has forgotten where El Salvador is. It's a very small country in Central America. And just to mention a few bits of information about the Salvadoran Civil War that happened between 1980 and 1992. So this was a conflict involving a left-wing rebellion by a group largely made up of subsistence farmers, campesinos or campesinas as they're called. So it was a conflict between these individuals and their government, which was an oppressive right-wing government that was making life very difficult for the poorest people in their country. This was also a government that was receiving military support from the United States, of course, because of Cold War anxieties about the growing global influence of communism. So with this sort of left-wing rebellion, the Salvadoran government was able to secure funding to put down that rebellion, not only funding, but also military equipment, helicopters, planes, and weapons. So before and also during the war, the army subjected the campesinos and campesinas to a whole range of pretty terrible things. There were civilian massacres, disappearances, torture was rife, sexual violence, and aerial bombardments of civilians and villages. And all these different difficult events forced many thousands of campesinos and campesinas into refugee camps in Honduras, and also into exile all across the Americas. Many, of course, came to Canada and the United States. During the Civil War, music became a really important place for the campesinos and campesinas to explore their experiences of the conflict. This is what I'm going to be talking about today. It was a space really for exploring the trauma of what was happening to them, promoting their cause in relation to the war, and a place to examine the challenges of everyday life as they were experiencing it either during the conflict in El Salvador or while living in refugee camps in Honduras. It's important, I think, to keep the events of the war in mind in working to understand as well the challenges that El Salvador is facing as a country today. These relate especially to colonialism and neocolonialism because of the ways in which the United States supported the Salvadoran government during the war, and then later because of the United States treatment of Salvadoran refugees that came to the United States, who were then sent back to El Salvador after involvement with pretty serious gang culture in the southern parts of the United States. Many refugees were returned to El Salvador as members of these gangs, and this is really a significant context for understanding the very challenging political situation that El Salvador faces today, in which the problem of the gangs has become so significant. Really, this problem goes back to the Civil War. It has its roots in the Civil War. The other major issue at play in El Salvador, as in many Central American countries, of course, is neocolonial exploitation of the land by transnational companies. So that's another really important issue today that also kind of has its roots in the sort of imperial involvement of the United States in the country during this period. So the work I'm going to talk about today was conducted, as you already heard, as part of a large project that is being funded currently by a $2.5 million SHIRK partnership grant. And it's a really large team of academics who work alongside Salvadoran collaborators. Salvadoran collaborators come from civil society groups, historical memory groups, and different government organizations. And together we work to document the campesino experience of the Civil War. And there's many different methodologies involved in this enterprise, many different branches of the research, which I'll describe in a moment. But we're particularly focused on taking individual testimonies as a way to document individual experiences, but also creating community consultations and community-based historical memory workshops where we listen to the experiences of a whole community talking together about what happened to them and their families. And you can see some of these kinds of consultations and workshops in the images here. So our goal is to document the history of the war from the campesinos' perspective to provide a more balanced picture alongside the more official narratives of the war that tend to come more from the government perspective. This kind of work, as well as recognition of the army massacres and memorials for those massacres. This kind of work is something that the United States has been calling for decades from the various Salvadoran governments that have led the country, both on the left and the right, since the conflict. But no government has yet sufficiently addressed this need for sort of truth and reconciliation type enterprise, right, of bringing people together and acknowledging what happened and memorializing the dead appropriately. So this is really the work that we're engaged in. And some of the partners that we're working with, the organizations and the municipalities that we're working with, are listed on this slide. So I'll show you now some of the different sorts of projects that we're involved with, just for your interest. So I mentioned before that we do a lot of historical memory work. As you can see here, working with small groups within communities. Often we jump off of photographs that we've gathered from the period and from people who worked in the refugee camps. These photos we're returning to El Salvador, to the communities where the people that are in them live. This kind of work is central to these memory workshops that where we can sort of work to document a range of experiences. We're also building online maps of massacres and where they took place. Again, this is something that has not been documented for many years. These massacres were denied by the government, and so of course there was no official recognition of them. And the stories of these massacres really live only in the memories of the people that experienced them. So we take testimonies from those survivors. We return with them to the sites of the massacres. And we mark those sites on an online map and attach the testimonies to those markers. We're also involved in creating physical memorials to the different massacres. We work with a group of Belgian architects who are designing memorials to the massacres, and all of these designs take place sort of through a community consultation. So there's never a kind of top-down forcing of a particular design. It's always comes from the ground up, and then there's a lot of back and forth with the campesinos and campesinas to determine what kind of memorial is most appropriate for that particular massacre. We attend and participate in the many commemoration activities that happen to remember, in particular, the different massacres from the war. These are very well attended and powerful events. We're involved in preserving and digitizing physical objects that have survived from the war. We're working with very small, mostly pretty small community museums to create exhibits. We've already published a book, and we're working on several others that speak to a specific community's memories and experiences. As I mentioned before, we bring photos with us to El Salvador, photos typically captured by aid workers working in the camps. Many Salvadoran refugees who lived in Honduras spent as much as a decade in the camps, and many of them have no photographic record of their time there, including many children that grew up there and have no photos from their childhood, and it's been very powerful to return those photos to the people depicted in them. Because of the terrible events of the war, there is a grave mental health deficit really in El Salvador in terms of a need to address mental health challenges that has not been met in any way, shape or form. So a part of our team is a group of psychiatrists who are assisting with mental health interventions. We're involved with projects recovering different sorts of traditional knowledge that existed in the years before the war that has been kind of eradicated by a lot of the sort of neo-colonial involvement in the country. On the artistic side, we've been involved in commissioning artistic representations of the war. This is already very much a facet of campesina culture, where you will always see murals and other sorts of artistic representations of the war in the villages, but we're helping to support and encourage that effort. We'll talk today about one of the films that we've made as part of the project. And I wanted to just show you this governance model, because this will give you a good sense too of the way that we approach this kind of project. It's not, in a way, kind of a typical academic approach, which might be considered more top-down. We created this diagram to try to represent what is in effect could also be described as a horizontal governance structure, but we've represented it here as sort of more in a circular fashion. It's really a deliberately sort of self-consciously decolonial approach to research, in which the scholars of the team think of ourselves as accompanying the campesinos and campesinas in their effort to document the conflict, rather than ourselves doing the work, right, or enforcing the work. We are aiding with that work instead. And this I think has an important historical context. Many scholarly researchers working on ethnographic projects with refugees, and with these refugees in particular as well, would often simply go visit the refugees, conduct interviews, kind of mine people for their trauma, and then leave, and then publish the results of their findings in English language academic journals, doing nothing really for the survivors whose memories they have extracted. Instead, we're really trying, the academics on our team, not to see ourselves as experts. The campesinos and campesinas are the experts in this context. We instead are facilitators, aiding them in their objective to document this part of their history. So every part of the research is conceived of with them and by them. So all of our research outputs directly respond to community needs. Salvadoran campesinos see themselves first and foremost as members of a community, so they make most decisions collectively and democratically in this context. As a result, they're leery of any decision that's sort of enforced upon them from outside, because of their experience, of course, with oppressive regimes and with neo-colonial capitalist exploitation of their land and their labor. And I think coming from the global north, coming from Canada, in my case from the UK, we need to be especially sensitive to this history. So my responsibility, finally, to get to that, along with a group of music graduate students from Western, is to help document the numerous folk songs written by campesinos during the war, and also to record refugees' memories of music making during the war. What I find interesting and important about these songs and about these stories is the ways in which they provide compelling documentation of campesinos' experiences of the war, and at the same time that they served for the campesinos and campesinas as a tool to help them to process what was happening to them and to help them to protest what was happening to them. Today, many of the older generation of campesinos, those that lived through the war as adults in most cases, but also in some cases who were children during the war, these older generations see in these songs a really crucial and important educational tool and opportunity to educate the youth So music is seen here as a kind of a vessel for intergenerational education. At the same time, the songs were used for others abroad as well, to educate them about the war and its effects. And all of this really, I mean, at the time was intended to try to stop the war, but now is very much about working to ensure that these kinds of divisions within the country don't ever happen again, right? So it's really about conversation and prevention and healing in order for the country to move forward productively. So with all of this in mind, the music team that I lead is working on a number of different projects. We are creating an online song archive, which will include all the wartime revolutionary folk songs that we can obtain recordings of. So we gather recordings of these songs from those that remember them while we're in El Salvador. We're also gathering recordings made at the time for storage on the archive. And there's also going to be the capacity for Salvadorans to record songs that they remember on their phones and upload them to the archive. So that will make it possible, hopefully, for us to gather a large number of songs from the period, because most of these songs are not documented. They exist primarily in oral memory, and in many cases, the younger generation simply aren't interested in hearing these sort of old-fashioned songs from the war, and so they're very much at risk of being lost if they aren't documented at this point, as the older generation dies. So these recordings then, our hope is that they'll set the stage for further workshops on music during the war, historical memory workshops, that we can also use them to undertake personal testimonies that sort of begin with music, so sort of using music as a starting point for a testimonial. And sorry, I just lost my place. Oh yeah, and we're also working on songbooks. So several of the communities that we're working with are very interested in creating books that include the song lyrics, and combining those lyrics, sort of placing them alongside testimony and memory about music making during the war and photographs of music making during the war. So that's another project that we're working on at the moment. We're also hoping that we can use the recordings that we gather to, again, for this goal of intergenerational education. So perhaps to use the archive as a means to inspire and motivate new songs written in present day musical languages by younger generations of Salvadorans that engage with this sort of archive of memory and song, is the idea. But really the overarching goal is to create mechanisms to share this history, the history in general and the history of this wartime folk music in Spanish, in this context, most particularly in El Salvador, with schools, with young people, but also to make this available to the rest of the world, to educate others too about what happened during the war, and to inform people about the existence of this musical tradition that, of course, is not well known outside of the country. So the songs themselves, the revolutionary song tradition, it draws really from several different Latin American folk and protest traditions, from what I can tell. And there's very little literature on this topic, so there isn't a kind of a clear consensus really on what the roots of this tradition are. But from what I've been able to ascertain so far, I think we can safely say that this is a tradition that shows very much the influence of Mexican and Colombian corridos, cumbias, and rancheras. So those are different Latin American genres that were very popular at this time. These weren't so much protest traditions; they were sort of everyday pop traditions. often what we'll see in these songs is that many of them actually take a well-known popular tune from the time and use that music as the basis of the song, but then apply revolutionary lyrics on top. So so they'll take a song that, you know, was just a kind of a simple love song or some other much more ordinary song, and then put a very serious sort of protest lyrics on top of it. And it's really in these lyrics that these songwriters who produce these songs are doing something quite different. These are highly political lyrics, very different from the style of these other genres, typically, as they were sort of hearing them at the time. And in the lyrics, these songs are showing much more similarity with Nueva Canción, so the leftist-infused, oppression-resisting folk music style made popular by musicians like Chile's Violeta Parra. They're also showing influence of Nueva Troca, another movement made famous by musicians like Cuba's Silvia Rodriguez. So actually music like that of Rodriguez and Nueva Canción, groups like Los Huragao, goodness, I don't know if I said that right. Those groups were banned at this time by the Salvadoran regime, but the music was very much circulating amongst the rebels. Of course, this is the era of tape, making recordings of other people's tape collections. And so those tapes, sort of black market tapes, would circulate in the rebel regions. So all of these genres, of course, are genres that celebrate simplicity, honesty in performance. They're very straightforward, very direct. And I think that this is very important for a group of campesinos and campesinas that are very much informed by the values of the left. It sets them musically in opposition to the sort of complexity and sophistication of what might be perceived as the country's elites. At the same time, though, there's a sort of a similar artistic strategy going on in using these kind of pop tunes. When you've got something that's already popular, that has kind of a lively rhythm that's engaging to listen to, it's a really effective venue to put very plainly presented lyrics on top, because it makes the very politically potent, sometimes really difficult music, sort of lyrical message more attractive, because the music is so enjoyable to listen to. And often this music would be danced to, even music that had lyrics that described the very worst events of the conflict. And I think too, we might say that in borrowing from these other Latin American traditions, and especially especially in borrowing aspects that connected them with other sort of left-wing protest movements in music, they help to emphasize the similarities, I think, between their struggle against oppression and those very similar struggles against oppression that were happening at this same time across many other parts of North and South America. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to look at some of the songs, and this is where I'm going to want to engage you. But first, I just thought I would ask if you have any questions about anything that I've said so far, or any other questions at this point before we actually finally listen to some music. Anyone want to jump in? There's no chat function, right, in Teams. So at least I'm not seeing any chat.
There is. It's,
there is? Oh.
yes, on the top menu bar,
Yeah.
you should see an icon that says chat.
Oh, I don't see one there. That's funny. Maybe it's not set up right. Is there anything in the chat?
Yes, there is. There's a comment from Lily Blanco. Lily, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll see if I can change my preferences to see that. Yeah, maybe you could just ask your questions verbally, that would be good.
Okay, let me read it out to you.
Sure.
It says, it is very unfair that just one side of the story is being shown and ignoring or not mentioning the tortures and massacres that the terrorist groups committed to the citizens.
Yes, and certainly that's one perspective, absolutely. And yeah, every war has two sides, and no one is ever innocent in any conflict. However, I will point out that the UN report into the conflict did document that the number of massacres perpetrated by the army upon the campesinos and campesinas dramatically outweighed the massacres or the crimes and the murders that happened by the rebels towards those on the other side, towards the army and others. This, of course, this is not a straightforward story, and no war is straightforward. And I don't wish to oversimplify things. Yeah, I think there's another question. Go ahead.
Hi. I'm just curious to know if there has been well, how the reception from the people in El Salvador has been towards this great assistance or facilitation, as you said, to document their memories. I just wonder how the reception has been.
Thanks. Yeah. So very positive. I mean, as I say, we're in a way simply facilitating efforts that are already happening. So we're working, many of the organizations that we partner with have been involved in conducting this work, for many decades. And so we are simply helping to facilitate that because of the money we've received from SHIRK. We're able to sort of financially support that. And then we bring sort of academic expertise as well to the table. But in general, in the communities where we're working, which are poor farming communities in the north, this sort of universal enthusiasm for the work that we're doing, and most of the community come out to attend our workshops, to listen to musical performances that we'll put on as part of our visit as well, and to share their memories. So many people feel that it's really important for their memories to be documented. And I think with any conflict, it's really important to get all the stories, right? It's really important to document everything that happened if you are to move towards reconciliation in the future, right? Learning can't come about in the dark, right? And so that's why it's important that all different sorts of perspectives on the conflict are represented. Yeah, we have another question. Charlie?
So I'm just wondering, most of the campesinos and campesinas are poor, right? So the archive is mostly online. So how do they have access to it? Because most of them probably don't have electronic devices or enough power to secure the internet.
Mm-hmm. So actually, most people in El Salvador have a cell phone, and Wi-Fi is available in different. People are quite savvy about getting access to Wi-Fi, even if they don't have it in their own homes. And so the internet is widely used in El Salvador. Cell phones are widely used, and that's one reason why we wanted to make it possible for people to upload songs using their phones. We also will, of course, record the songs live while we're in El Salvador, and then upload them themselves when we get back. I mean, it's been a conversation about whether an online archive is the way to go, because, of course, yeah, like in terms of access, right? Is that the best place to store music? So one thing that we're also going to do is we're also going to sorry about that. We're also going to create some albums, which will be sort of more, conventionally released in places like Spotify. So that will be another way that people will be able to access the music. The challenge, of course, with music is, how do you archive musical recordings? I mean, the old-fashioned way would have been to put them in some kind of museum or archival facility, those recordings, where only researchers really would have accessed them, right? So that will happen as well to some extent. We're collaborating with many museums. So some of the songs will be preserved there as well. But the idea really was to have this available and also to have it be a tool for teachers, so that Salvadoran teachers can use this as a resource as well. And we're working on some sort of teaching resources that might accompany some of these recordings. But thanks, yeah, good question. It's a complicated question for sure. Mm-hmm. Thanks, guys. Excellent questions. All right, so let's move on now and finally take a look at some songs. So I want us to sort of use these songs as a way to reflect on the ways that sort of kind of the functions of music in a wartime context, and particularly the functions of music for this particular group of individuals in this particular context. And I'm really interested, as I say, to hear from you with your thoughts on this music, and to hear your ideas on the kinds of functions that it might have served, both for the campesinos that were living in El Salvador and for those who were in exile, because many of these songs became popular in the Honduran refugee camps that many of them lived in. So I'm going to begin by playing a clip from a documentary that our research team created. And this documentary is about the life of one campesino musician. And here he is in the pictures here. His name was Novato Amaya, and he was known to most as Don Tito. This was a man who'd been a campesino before the war, but he became involved in political mobilizing in opposition to the government in his role as a catechist. So he was one of many in the rebel communities who was using religion to educate the campesinos and campesinas about leftist politics, about oppression, to help them to reveal what they felt was the truth of their situation, and they would use tools. They'd use stories of biblical oppression to do this, to educate the largely uneducated individuals in their communities. So that was what he was doing in the early years of the war. This song that I'm going to play for you is the first song that he wrote, and it describes a massacre that he experienced and survived as he and his community were trying to flee their village to get across the border to Honduras to reach the refugee camps. This was an event called the Lempa River Massacre. Here you can see a children's drawing from a collection that was gathered in the refugee camps, depicting this child's memories of this massacre. And these are some pictures that survive of the massacre. Here you can see the planes that dropped bombs on this large group of civilians that were attempting to flee their villages, which were under attack, and to cross the river from El Salvador into Honduras. Many hundreds of civilians died during this massacre. We don't have an accurate amount, again, because, as I say, these massacres were denied by the army at the time. But certainly we know from eyewitness reports that many hundreds of people died while trying to cross the river, as bombs fell on their heads and as soldiers shot at them, actually from both sides of the river, from the Honduran side and the Salvadoran side. So the song that we're going to hear, it's called El 17 de Marzo, and it was the very first song that Norberto Amaya wrote, a sort of very visceral reaction to this experience. He would go on, though, to become quite famous in the Mesa Grande refugee camp where he lived in Honduras. And he was also sometimes heard on the rebel radio stations in El Salvador as well. So I'm going to play you a little excerpt from the documentary. And in this section, he's talking, well, rather, we're playing him an old recording of this song. And this is a recording that was made in the refugee camp by an aid worker. And this is a recording that he used to have many years ago, but he lost. And it was very moving for him to hear again these recordings of himself singing in the refugee camps. So it's kind of a little bit hard to watch, because you can see on his face that he's remembering his experience of the massacre as he listens to himself singing about it. But after we've watched it, I want to talk about your reactions to it and to think a little bit about, as I say, the purposes that a song like this might have served, both for Don Norberto and for those in the refugee camps where he performed it. So let's just take a listen.
La primera canción que hice de la bajada de Río Lempa. Le hice la primera canción a esa bajada de Río Lempa del 18 de marzo de 1981.
El 17 de marzo.
Ahí está.
Nunca lo olvido yo.
La voz, sí.
Quedaron solas las casas, toda la masa salió. Quedaron solas las casas, toda la masa salió. Cuando bajaron a Lempa, aquella gran población, la iban siguiendo los pasos, Herodes y el faraón. La iban siguiendo los pasos, Herodes y el faraón. Cuando cruzaban el río, se oía gran llorazón. Mujeres, niños y ancianos, cuando tiraba el avión. Mujeres, niños y ancianos, cuando tiraba el avión.
Okay, so here are the lyrics for you in Spanish and with an English translation. And I've suggested in a box up in the top right some different lenses through which we might sort of analyze and interpret this song. Perhaps you might want to take a moment just to read through the lyrics again and to think about the song in relation to these different lenses. Apologies, this should say, I will never forget it. Okay, so let's start with documentation. if we think about this song as a kind of a primary source, documenting a lived experience, what kind of role is a song like this serving in this kind of conflict situation? And in what ways might songs be important as documentation during the war? Any thoughts about that? Yes, Raphael.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking back to what you said at the beginning of the lecture, how the government in El Salvador was rather repressive about these massacres. So because they weren't taking accountability for the fact that they took place, perhaps this song and many others that Don Tito would have written would serve not only as a way to establish that these experiences, of course, did happen, not only because they're remembered by the people, but also now in a way that's more accessible to others that would be able to hear the song. So in a way, documenting those experiences therein.
Excellent. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in a context where these events are being denied, a song like this can serve as a kind of, yeah, like almost like a newspaper report, right? And yet, of course, it's not a newspaper report, it's a song. So what about it being a song makes that documentation different, do you think?
I suppose that because it is a, well, it's rather emotive, of course, and it's not just showing that Don Tito did in fact not only survive that massacre, it's also in a way kind of it kind of encompasses the fact that many people didn't in fact died, and those memories would not be able to be passed down to anyone had this song not even been recorded or even written.
Yeah, exactly. Yesenia, if I said your name right. Go ahead.
Yes. You totally did pronounce it right, so good. I was just going to add that in this kind of a context, I think that these kinds of songs are very important to, and I thank you for your work, to keep alive. I don't think that there would be a lot of documentation that would tell the true story of what was going on, especially because at the time they were targeting scholars, professors, anyone really who had some kind of academic background or an important role in society. So these people were kind of like blackmailed. You couldn't really tell the truth about what was going on. So things like this are kind of a reliable source for us to look back and not just acknowledge what happened, but also protest about what occurred.
Thank you. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Many academics and religious leaders who told these stories, some of them, either they were sort of blacklisted or in some cases murdered. The other important piece to mention here, which I haven't mentioned so far, is that many campesinos and campesinas were illiterate. And so as a result, they didn't have any mechanism to write down their experiences, to share them with others. Of course, this is pre-cell phones and cameras, and these weren't things that poor farmers would have been carrying on their person while fleeing a conflict. And that's why we have so little sort of physical documentation. But there are many eyewitness accounts, including accounts by international observers who were waiting on the Honduran side of the river. And yeah, these first-hand accounts of people that were actually amongst the group crossing the river are enormously important. And we're gathering those now as testimonies, but first-hand memories like this from the war are actually super rare. So it's kind of interesting to think of a song as a sort of historical primary source, right? That we can turn back to see what it was actually like for people living through this experience. And I think too, then what that does in this context, right, in the context of the moment when it happened, is in documenting the conflict, he's setting the stage for justice, right? The song, as you can see, I think in the lyrics, it's very flat. It's very documentary. It's not. It describes what happened, but there are elements that are more emotive. But you can almost feel the shock of the song, right? And I think the way that it ends, especially, there's no sense of like where we go from here. This is just a really visceral, in the moment kind of reaction. And so that too is kind of powerful as documentation. Okay, so then going from there to protest, like what's the journey from documentation to protest? How is this song, or is this song serving as a form of protest, do you think? What is there in the music and the lyrics that allows it to function as a tool of protest? Anyone have any thoughts? I mean, I think it's really in this documentary function that the song works as protest. It's almost in its kind of emotional flatness that it works effectively as protest, because it feels like a kind of, it's just a narrative, right, of what happened. It's not talking about what to do next. It's not telling anyone what to do. I mean, it's emotive in its description, right? I mean, there are some emotive words in there, a great cry. They died as lambs. You know, these aren't neutral, of course. These definitely aren't neutral, these phrases. But in so kind of blow by blow describing what happened, it performs a protest function. What about faith? What is he doing here? And this is a kind of more of a literary exercise, looking at the lyrics. What's happening? In what ways is he turning to religion in this song, and to what end? Jasmine.
Yeah, you can definitely see he has lots of parallels with the El Salvadorians, or the campesinos, and the children of Israel in the Bible. They were very discriminated against group of people, and they often had to leave. And so it talks about Herod and Pharaoh who would chase them. They crossed a river, which is also like how it was in the Bible as well. And then at the end where it says that they died as lambs is reflective of the Bible, because it talks about the sacrifice of lambs and how Jesus was the sacrifice, and also they sacrificed lambs for their sins.
Excellent. Do you maybe want to remind anyone that isn't so familiar with Catholic teachings and with the Bible, who were Herod and Pharaoh kind of the enemies of, right? Who were they chasing?
Yeah, for sure. So Pharaoh was the Egyptian leader, and he had the Israelites as slaves in Egypt. And he had them as slaves, and he also was a murderer because they were growing too high a number. And then Herod was also the enemy. He was the ruler during the time of Jesus and Jesus' birth, and he declared like a massacre of all the baby boys, as well as Pharaoh, but so that in resistance to the birth of Jesus.
Excellent. Yeah, so both of these are kind of biblical figures that are associated with massacres and oppression, in opposition to God's people, right? So what he's doing effectively is kind of casting the campesinos and campesinas as themselves God's people. It's worth remembering too that, of course, Pharaoh was out to get Moses, right? And Moses was the one who parted the Red Sea to take his people into freedom. And so this idea, the idea of crossing water to reach freedom, right? That's a very powerful metaphor here too, I think. And I think it's like I find it kind of remarkable the level of sophistication, right, in the metaphors here, especially if you think that Don Roberto was himself illiterate, had very little schooling, but this is quite sophisticated poetry, and especially too for someone who's just survived a terrible event. So what about identity? I put the word identity on the list here. How do you think a song like this might be helping to reinforce a sense of shared identity amongst the campesinos and campesinas, and why would that be important, do you think, at a moment like this? And I think it might be useful to think here too about the music of the song as well as the lyrics. Yeah, go ahead, Luis.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Dr. Abrams, for the presentation. It's amazing. Just to reply to your question about identity, and I think it was a little bit related with the documentation and testimony. I think the fact that here Don Norberto is including a community, it's already creating a sense of identity, not only for himself, but for the community, right? So it's expressing that awareness of an action that happened not only to himself but for the rest of the community. So in a way, on a testimonial perspective, today we will think that Don Norberto is speaking for himself, but also for the community. So giving the voice to those who cannot speak for themselves.
Exactly. Yeah, and you'll notice too the pronouns, right? He starts out, my typo, unfortunately is there, but the first line he's talking about himself, but after that he doesn't speak again about himself. He talks about they, which is interesting, and relates a little bit to my next item, trauma, right? A little bit of distancing, maybe emotional distancing as a way to process what's happening here. But I think too, in kind of creating the they, I mean, this connects with the religious aspect, right? That is, it's God's people, they, this shared, this group with a sort of a similar experience, a similar identity. I think that's really important. I also think in terms of the music, I mean, if we it's quite a sort of an upbeat song. It's not a tragic kind of morose song, musically speaking. It has a sort of waltz-like rhythm. It's very typical for folk songs of this region, right? And I think in using that kind of music, right, which is so much central to, the experience of being a Salvadoran, living in Central America, this helps to kind of ground someone who might be feeling a kind of a threat to their identity in this moment. These are people that are being forced to leave the country that they live in because of a threat to their safety from their own government. So identity is really under attack in a moment like this. And I think a really important function that musicians like this are serving is that they're helping to give people back a feeling of pride in their identity and a feeling of connection to others. And just the act of making music too gives that feeling of connection. So when he later will sing this song in the refugee camps where he lives, it brings people together. Often, and we witnessed this in our workshops in El Salvador, and Luis was there in several of them with us. Many people will dance to songs like this, even songs with lyrics like this that describe such a terrible event that many of them actually experienced. They will dance to this song. And so that I find fascinating, but it tells you a lot about what this music is doing, right? It gives people a space to come together, to feel connected, to find joy in a way, even amidst this this suffering and the immensely challenging situation that they're going through. So let's just talk then finally about that suffering and the trauma element of the song. Does anyone have any thoughts on what we might learn from thinking about this song through the lens of trauma? No romances here. Ivan. Hey there.
Hello there. Definitely from the lens of trauma, it is very evident that they are going through a struggle, that they are being objectified into the sense that they do not matter, that they are replaceable, and that no matter what action they could choose, whether it's fighting or fleeing, they are just being bombed on. They are being torn apart. It is interesting to note how these lenses intertwine with each other, from the basic evidence of trauma to the trauma affecting the identity of the people themselves.
Excellent.
I personally, from a peace and conflict perspective, I never truly understood how a single song such as this can really unite, and not only unite, but create bridges between societies and between groups of people. Um, in talking about lenses and identity, not only in the religious perspective of how he talks about it, but also in that everyone has passed through a certain amount of trauma, everyone has faced it. And when you dance to it, or when people come together to sing a song such as this, you really change the atmosphere from just a normal regular day of getting past certain struggles to reflecting on events that happened from such as the 17th of March to this day and age.
Yeah.
It is very interesting to see this perspective. So I thank you for it. And I believe that the traumatic event of this is evident in itself.
Absolutely. Thanks. Really well put. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And you'll notice in the lyrics how he talks about once walking on Honduran land, free from repression, the green men came out, Pharaoh's family. And here what he's referencing is the fact that Honduran soldiers also shot at the refugees coming into El Salvador, even as they are being bombed on the Salvadoran side and in the river. So even once in Honduras, supposedly the promised land kind of thing, from a religious perspective, the safe place they were trying to get to be safe, there too they faced threats. And although many Salvadorans were able to live in refugees in many Salvadorans were able to live in refugee camps in Honduras, they weren't 100% safe in those refugee camps, and unsavory things happened there too that affected their safety. So yeah, so kind of multiple levels of challenge here for sure. Yeah, you have another observation, Ivan? Or was your hand just still up? No, okay.
Sorry, my hand was still up. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I think you might also say, thinking about this through the lens of trauma, that that in kind of offering this very kind of matter-of-fact description of what happened, and this is sort of based on my own. Since I started doing this work, I spent a lot of time researching trauma and thinking about how music can become a space for processing trauma. If from what you know about trauma, you probably will already know that one common response to a highly traumatic event is the repression of the memory, right? Many of those with PTSD will repress the most difficult memories, won't be able to deal with them, and so the brain just can't process something that terrible. And for some individuals, that will result in this PTSD repression of the memory. I think, although he probably didn't know it, I think Don Norberto is fulfilling a really important function here in helping the Salvadorans resist that repression of this difficult memory. He puts it right in front of them, right? It's right there. Every gory detail of what happened is right there in this song. And I think that helps to bolster resilience. It gives them tools, emotional tools for dealing with what happened to them. This is like a lot to put on one song, right? But I do think that songs can do this. They give people a space to manage really difficult things that are happening to them, a space to just kind of process, right? The things that have happened, to fully acknowledge how completely unacceptable they are, right? And how terrible they were, and that people died, people that they loved died in this massacre. And actually, Don Norberto himself did talk a little about this in our interviews with him. He said, for example, that his music was like a food. He said the song feeds, right? So he sort of understood that his music fills this psychological function for the people that listen to them. And I think that psychological function is partly about forcing people to keep these terrible details of the massacre present in their conscious. And this relates to protest, right? Because if you just block out the terrible thing that happens and never speak of it again, you can't get justice, right? You can't get change, you can't get progress, you can't get peace. And that, of course, is what they wanted. I think, moreover, that what's really interesting, this is an argument that I'm sort of making about what's going on with these songs. I think what's really interesting about these songs, and I think it's a really interesting facet of many music protest traditions across this region, and actually in North America too, during this period, is that I think that this song is able to do two things at once. I think it's fostering a kind of psychological resilience, and it's offering political resistance both at the same time. So it isn't just a place where people are able to psychologically deal with what they're dealing with. It isn't just that. And it isn't just a protest song. It's both of those things at the same time. And I think that that's something that we haven't sort of fully theoretically wrapped our heads around yet. I don't think we really have the tools to understand yet what that looks like. And I think that is a really important facet of a lot of these kinds of traditions during this period. You could also say, I think you could say this too about Nueva Canción in Chile. You could say this about some of the songs of the US civil rights movement, that they're doing that too. There's both political resistance and psychological resilience kind of bound up together in these songs. And I think music is somehow uniquely positioned to offer that kind of bringing together of ingredients, right? In a way that not many other things can. A speech can't, an artwork can't. Music somehow can do that, I think, and that's I think that's super interesting. I don't think that trauma scholars in the global north have yet done a good job of understanding how those two things come together, and I think that one of the reasons for that is that this is a very, very much a story associated with the experiences of oppressed groups in the Americas, and it doesn't really fit well with a kind of a European global north type understanding of what trauma is, which is super individualist and not at all collectivist as these societies are. I will say though that psychological theory from Latin America does a much better job of helping to unpick what's going in here, and I won't go into that in lots of detail, but it's interesting to explore if you're interested in understanding the sort of psychological functions of traditions like this. Professor Castaneda, you had a comment. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you for this.
Oh, I can't hear you.
Oh.
Just a bit distant.
There we are. Sorry. I just wanted to thank you for this great presentation, and I just wanted to add to what you were saying, that music is also a social activity. So the fact that I can sense it from watching the video. You can sense that there's a community around Don Tito that's listening along with him and sharing and going through the emotion as a group. And I think this is also an element that helps in healing and getting over trauma. So yes, I completely agree with what you were saying.
Yeah, and I think that's totally present in this song as well, right? Isn't it? In the third person aspect of it, right? It's not about me. And this community, like so many of these kinds of communities across Latin America, and we observe this in our conversations too in their communities, that these aren't people that think of themselves as sort of having had, I had a terribly traumatic experience and I have PTSD and I have suffered. The experience is always collective, right? The experience is always, we need help to deal with what happened to us, right? My suffering is no greater or less than anyone else. This is a collective experience that we want to document. And that's why we do historical memory workshops, because people want to talk kind of as a group. And that's very different, right, from the way that we think of ourselves in the world, or the way that I was raised to think of myself in the world, right, being born in the UK. And I think many Canadians think of themselves in the world, right? And I think, yeah, music in these contexts is that, I mean, music is always important as a sort of a communal thing, but it's especially important when community is the thing that helps you to survive, right? Yesenia.
Yeah, sorry, I just had a question about regarding mental health and also the cultural component that it plays. I was wondering about that because I myself am from El Salvador, and my parents also, well, they escaped the Civil War, so we also know a lot of people who have as well. But the sense that I've gotten personally is that people don't want to talk about it. And I know at least in Latin America, mental health, it's something, it's kind of like a new initiative that is being worked on, but there's always that stigma. And so I was wondering if that stigma actually plays a role to impede people from telling a story, or if you have gotten very positive impressions of this, and people wanting to be involved in and talking about their experience. That's kind of surprising to me to hear that, but it's a good thing.
That's super interesting that you say that. Yeah, and that is an experience that we've had many times. I think there may be, and I don't, this is a generalization, but there may be some interesting differences between Salvadorans who left the region and Salvadorans who went to the refugee camps and stayed and then came back to El Salvador. I think that those that came back to El Salvador have really done a great deal of work to keep these memories alive. And so it's much more normalized to talk about this than it is, I think, for many of the refugees who went to places like Canada and the United States, where, because they didn't have any tools, therapeutic tools to help them deal with what had happened to them, for many of those people, the only way to deal with it was to just put it away, right? And to throw themselves into their new life. And of course, these kind of two paths are something that you see with many refugees who flee terrible conflicts and find themselves in radically different countries in a sort of a peaceful environment, right? Whether how one chooses to deal with those difficult memories is a very personal thing. But I do, and I would also say, though, that those that still live in El Salvador, also, there are many different ways that people deal with this. And some people are so profoundly traumatized that they are more or less unable to function without the help of their families. Some people do not wish to come to our workshops and talk about this because it's simply too difficult. But it is striking to me how many people do want to talk about it. Some people will just come and listen. They don't want to share their own memories necessarily. Some people will come and then gradually the memory will come, or they'll feel more, and some people will say, I've never talked about this before, but now I want to tell you, please can we go do a one-on-one testimony, right? It's so diverse, right? But I do think that efforts like this and the sort of memorial efforts that have happened since the war, the memorial events that are hosted every year at the anniversary of these different massacres, for example, these things are super important. But thank you for sharing that personal story. Yeah, it's very interesting. Okay, well, it's 5:15. I was going to play you one more song, but I think I won't. I think this is actually a good place to end. But I did want to give people the opportunity if they have any other questions before we wrap up. No? Lily, yes. Lily, do you want to say something? I can't hear you. No, I guess not.
Lily, your mic might be muted.
No. Or if you want to write it in the chat, that's also fine. And perhaps Professor Castaneda can pass it along.
For sure, definitely.
Does anyone else have any questions?
In the meantime, Professor, I just wanted to ask, I understand that you were in El Salvador not too long ago, continuing with your research, and I was wondering if the current political situation with the new president, the coolest dictator, he's called himself, if this has had any effect in your research, and if music is starting to play a role again, perhaps?
Yeah, I feel like I don't yet know. I can't quite articulate yet what impact it's going to have. I mean, things have dramatically changed in El Salvador, that's for sure. And for those of you that don't know, the president has imprisoned many thousands of gang members. It's just kind of rounded them up and put them all in prison. And so many Salvadorans are super happy about this because suddenly their lives aren't being dictated by the gangs anymore, which has been, had a devastating effect on the country for the last few decades. But of course, at the same time, it raises kind of complicated questions about due process and the sort of the legalities of wrapping people up, locking people up without a proper legal process. So certainly people feel much greater sense of security, and this is one reason I think why the president has enormous levels of support in El Salvador right now, because people's lives have dramatically changed because of this policy. But one can't help but wonder, how this is going to play out, right? When and how will these people be released from prison? Will they stand trial? What happens when they're let out? What's happening while they're in prison that could make things even worse when one day they come out? There's lots of really challenging questions, and I think people are talking about these things very much in El Salvador. It's really complicated, but yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what this means for our project. That is also not really clear yet. Where the president will position himself on this. He seems to have done a little bit of a kind of both sides. He's not really picking a side, right? Which is sort of interesting. So we don't really know yet how it's gonna go down or how he's gonna react. In some ways, he's talked about working with those that are interested in building memorials to remember the different massacres. But on the other hand, he said things that are more critical of this kind of work too. So it's hard to know what he thinks or what will happen, given that he's gaining significant amounts of power right now in the country. Yeah, so.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't see Lily's question. Maybe perhaps someone else sees something in the chat, but my chat is not updating, so I'm not sure if she did enter a question in the chat. But if not, I think this is a great place to end. Let's give her one more minute, see if she... Oh, there she is. Lily.
Yesenia has also raised her hand.
Okay, Yesenia.
Sorry, I just wanted to say the two comments. I'm not sure if you're able to read the chat, but there are two comments, one that Lily made before. And one more question if you want to take it. The comment by Lily was, just want to add that what you said about one overweighing the other is a dangerous statement. If we are to defend memory and truth, we need to start from showing both sides of the story so that students can then be educated from the facts, not to deny the suffering of so many innocents nor justify any type of injustice, but it's important that students understand the horrors that those terrorist groups did to the citizens. There are references regarding this, not just from the citizens, but even from ex-members of those terrorist groups. So that was Lily's comment. I don't know if anyone wants to comment back on that. And there's one more question after.
Thanks, Yesenia. Thanks for passing that along. And yes, I agree. That's absolutely true. These stories need to be told. I think there has been more documentation of those stories over the stories that we're helping to bring to the surface. But I think certainly, yeah, for El Salvador to move forward, all of these, all of the bad things that happened during the war need to be brought to attention. And the UN report that I mentioned does indeed document atrocities on both sides that need to be, you know, accepted and acknowledged and understood. Yeah.
Right. And the last question is from Charlie Von Rios. She's saying, I'm wondering what Salvadorians think about the US. And I could probably answer this, but I will let you go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
There is not a positive view about the US, also because of what Dr. Ansari was saying in the beginning. A lot of the war was funded by the US. And so not only did they come in, extract resources, and continue to exploit the country, but they are, I mean, not to blame them completely, because we need to take accountability as a country about leadership and everything. But if they didn't supply with their finances all those weaponry, all the airplanes, everything, it wouldn't have been as devastating as it is today. And because the relationship just keeps deteriorating between the two countries, with you know, Salvadorians being deported from the U.S. after looking for refuge there, and even just the stigma against Latinos in general. That, I mean, that doesn't help. So we're not doing too good. There is lots of room for improvement, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for saying that as well. Well put, I think. And I think what you're describing certainly matches what I've heard from Salvadorans living in El Salvador as well. It's complicated feelings. Yeah. And yet, of course, many Salvadorans also are who are trying to get away from gangs and who are trying to save their children from being forced to join gangs. For many of them, the main place of potential refuge is the United States, right? And many Salvadorans have family members that are in the United States, who went there during the war, or who've gone there more recently. And for them, the United States is, you know, a safe haven from a very dangerous situation. So it's super complicated. It's super complicated. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all so much. This has been wonderful. I've really enjoyed speaking with you all and hearing your perspectives. And it's been a great pleasure. And thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I'll just like to remind everybody that we're going to have another event on October 26th. We have a guest speaker at 1 p.m. Her name is Dr. Madeline Cawas, and she will talk about Latino senses of place in Toronto. So you're all cordially invited, and we'll see you then. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.